What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Today we're going to be taking a look at a young man's argument that supposedly proves that God definitely does exist.
So to say that there's no concrete evidence for God is just ridiculous. It's clear that they've never actually researched a lot of these proofs, because there is very concrete evidence for God. The fact that our world is structured the way it is, to assume that there's no base thing holding everything in place, holding that structure in place, is completely ridiculous.
How do you know what I have and have not researched? The fact is you don't know. Just because you're convinced of some bad arguments doesn't mean that I haven't considered those arguments. This is a very narcissistic view that you have. In this particular argument, you have no way of separating God from nature or the natural world. There is just no need for a conscious being to exist for reality to exist. It can just naturally exist like other things just naturally exist without the supernatural intervention of God. Well, if you want to know this guy's complete argument and why he's wrong, then please stay tuned. So, this young man starts out by reading a Reddit post that puts forth the divine hiddenness argument. Basically, if God does exist, then why don't we have evidence already? Why doesn't God undeniably prove his existence to us? Why does God use ambiguous and vague ways in which to reveal himself to us? These are all great questions to ask that a religious person would have to answer if they were trying to convince you that God exists. Let's see how this guy answers these questions.
Well, this argument is the culprit of a fallacy known as circular reasoning, and that is, it assumes its conclusion is true before it proves its conclusion. Notice it says that nobody's found any credible evidence of God's existence, but where is the evidence that nobody has found any credible evidence with?
Here you go. All the evidence that there is no evidence. Right here. In all seriousness, though, it's not circular reasoning. No credible evidence means that no evidence has been found that hasn't been refuted or shown to not support the conclusion that it comes to. There may be arguments or evidence that personally convinces you, but that doesn't mean that it should or that it does convince everybody. Also, there's no way for me to show you all the non-evidence for God. You first need to propose an argument for the existence of God for me to explain to you why it's not convincing or why it doesn't support your conclusion. Most of the arguments for God are actually God of the gaps arguments that stem from personal incredulity. You don't understand why something is the way that it is, therefore God did it. I really hope you don't fall into these fallacious type of arguments.
Within this argument, it's nowhere, because obviously there is credible evidence of God's existence. We're going to get into that in just a second. But obviously, if you assume that nobody's found any credible evidence for God's existence, you are going to believe that God does not exist. That's pretty obvious, and you haven't actually proven anything. So,
well, nobody is saying that proves that God doesn't exist. Just that we don't believe in God or believe God to exist. This is not a claim about what absolutely exists in reality. It's merely a claim about what we believe. What we believe to be true can be vastly different from what is absolutely true. We also don't have to prove anything. That's y'all's job.
What is some of the evidence for Christianity? Well, today the argument I want to go over specifically is Edward Feser's Aristotelian argument. So let's begin talking about this argument. What is the Edward Feser Aristotelian argument? Well, it begins with the idea that things change, right? We all observe change every single day, and all kinds of change. For example, my hand is right here and it moves to right there. It's changed from being here to being over there. Okay, change.
Okay, I feel like this is going to take some LSD in order for me to actually taste God's ball sack.
Now, change involves the movement from potential to actual. So look, my hand's right here. It's potentially over here, and now it's actually over there. Okay, I moved it from potential to actual.
Whoa. Oh yeah. Now we're cooking with gas. Shit. What's next?
If something moves from potential to actual, it has to be moved by something that is already actual. Okay, so.
Well, yeah. My body used energy in order to contract my muscles so that my hand would wave back and forth. I really don't see how this is supernatural.
You know, my hand is able to move from potentially over here to actually over here because it's receiving signals from my nerves, which are getting electrical signals from my neurons, which is supported by a cellular structure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everything which is actualized, which moves from potential to actual, is actualized by something that is already actual. You cannot have an infinite number of things that have potential and are moving from potential to actual.
Why can't we have an innumerable amount of things moving from potential to actual? You don't have any evidence that says that we can't have that. I feel like this is just a fancy version of the prime mover argument that has long been debunked. It originated with Thomas Aquinus, and it assumes that nature itself cannot be the mover. There must be some conscious being that's the prime mover that causes things to happen in reality. Modern physics has definitely shown that objects are just as naturally at rest as they are moving at a constant speed in a single direction.
Now, what I want to distinguish is a lot of people think that this is moving backwards in time, like it's just moving backwards towards the Big Bang, and the Big Bang is the first action, right? But it's not that. It's more like, imagine that you are at the top floor of a skyscraper, right? And you look down and you can't see the bottom of the skyscraper, but the top floor, right, is supported by the floor under it, and the floor under it is supported by the floor under it, and then the floor under that is supported by the floor under that. Well, if you're standing on top of the skyscraper and it hasn't fallen over, you have to assume that at some point the skyscraper touches the ground. If it doesn't, then it wouldn't have anything to stand on. It would fall over. And it's the same with this. We're talking about the structure of the universe, what is holding everything in place.
All right, I get what you're trying to say here, but I still feel like you have to distinguish God from the natural world. I need you to explain to me why God is necessary for reality to have structure and to function like it does. I mean, what I see here is you just simply baselessly claiming that we need some kind of causal agent in order for reality to have structure and function. But I just don't see the evidence that suggests that is actually necessary. Everything that has happened in the past that we once attributed to God was later found out to be some natural process that happens without God's intervention. The water cycle is a good example that I use regularly. We don't need God for rain to happen or for lightning to spark.
What allows change to happen? So what is the thing at the bottom that ends this chain of things moving from potential to actual, potential to actual, potential to actual, potential to actual? It has to be something that has no potential. That is, it's completely actual.
What do you mean by what allows things to happen? It feels like you're just baselessly asserting that something needs to allow changes to happen in this reality. Change is just something that happens as a fact of reality. It's an intrinsic trait of the fabric of reality. There is nothing to indicate that we need some kind of causal agent or conscious being to allow things to change. What he means in this section is that this God or conscious being that gives structure to reality is immutable or unchanging. What he means is that this God or conscious being that gives structure to reality is unchanging or immutable. What we do know is that the characteristics and processes of reality are immutable. What you need to establish in your argument is a clear separation between this God or conscious being and the very nature of reality. Our past experiences show us that nature just has these immutable or unchanging processes and characteristics. Now, that doesn't mean that this is absolutely true. I don't think that we can ever really know that. But also, I'm not the one that's making the claim that I do know that. You're just baselessly asserting that God had to be the one to do it. This is still a God of the Gaps argument stemming from personal incredulity.
But essentially what it is it's something which cannot change, but can make other things change. So whatever this thing is, it must be outside of time and space. Okay, now we also know that this fully actualized actualizer is the basis for all action in the universe. It has to be, because of all the premises that we've gone through, right? So because it is the basis for all change, we can call it omnipotent. It is the most powerful thing, right? The most powerful thing possible, because all power in the entire universe is derived from this thing. In order for it to put something into action without itself being acted upon.
So, I have a couple of issues with all of this. First, like I've said before, you have to be able to separate your God from the very fabric of reality. What I need to know is what indicates that this immutable thing can't just simply be nature. Nature can cause a lot of things to happen on its own and to itself. And all of our previous experience points us in the direction that nature is this immutable thing that you're talking about. So I can get on board with your whole argument here if you can just tell me what indicates that it can't just simply be the natural world and how it works. Also, I feel like you're anthropomorphizing the natural world in order to give people the sense that it needs to be a conscious being. Or maybe yourself have been confused by others. There's really no need to give agency to reality. I feel like this is a baseless leap in logic, also known as a God of the Gaps.
It needs to be able to do that by its own will, right? So it has to have a will and an intelligence.
I mean, is there a reason why it needs will and intelligence? Is intelligence needed for rain to occur or lightning to strike? What in the natural world needs intelligence in order to happen? Does will come into play when it rains or when photosynthesis occurs? If the natural world doesn't require consciousness, will, or intelligence for the processes that we know about, why are those things inherently needed for processes that we don't know about? It would be totally awesome if you or anyone could answer those questions for me.
What we've essentially described here is we've described God. This being, it can't be more than one thing, right? It can't be polytheism. There can't be multiple of these things. And the reason for that is if there were two beings which were fully actualized, right? They were everything that they could possibly be. They were the maximum of everything, right? They had no potential. Then what would be the difference between them? They wouldn't be in a different place. They wouldn't be in a different time. They wouldn't have any different attributes. They'd be the same thing, right? So it's logically impossible to have two of these beings. There can only be one.
There can be only one.
According to this proof, because if there was more than one, well, they would have nothing different. They would be the same thing.
I don't see a reason why two of the same thing can't be occupying the same space. If they are both fully actualized with all 67,000 chakras open, I don't understand why they can't just snuggle up to each other. You just baselessly assert that two items of the same thing can't exist. You need to substantiate that claim. I know you kind of attempt to here with the whole argument of they wouldn't be different, they would be the same thing. But I don't see how that precludes it from existing.
Kind of like if you have any two objects, right, that there are some things that are different about them, and that's how you know they're different objects. If they were in the same place, same time, looked exactly the same, were made of the exact same material, the exact same atoms, like everything about them was exactly the same, they're just the same thing. There's not two different things, actually.
I'm sorry, but in what universe are you speaking coherently? Because it's not this one. True, two things cannot occupy the exact same space with the exact same atoms at the exact same time, but all of those attributes were not attributed to the God figure that you've created in your argument. Which, by the way, you started out this entire video by saying this.
What is some of the evidence for Christianity? Well,
none of this is evidence for Christianity. At best, you could say that it's a specific definition for a more deistic God. But in any case, you're creating a false dichotomy here. According to you, it's either a single creator or this ultra-specific definition of more than one creator. These aren't the only two answers for this question. Like, for example, there could be no creator.
So to say that there's no concrete evidence for God is just ridiculous. It's clear that they've never actually researched a lot of these proofs, because there is very concrete evidence for God.
Where is this concrete evidence? Mind you, concrete evidence is hard evidence and undeniable evidence. It's evidence whose best explanation is that God exists. Evolution has a lot of concrete evidence for it. What is your concrete evidence exactly?
The fact that our world is structured the way it is, to assume that there's no base thing holding everything in place, holding that structure in place, is completely ridiculous.
No, that is not concrete evidence. But also, nobody is arguing this. We don't argue that there's no structure or anything like that. In fact, I would say that is one major argument against the supernatural. And that would be the fact that this reality is consistent and has structure to it. The only thing that we differ on is why reality remains consistent and has structure. You think a conscious being is needed in order to give it those attributes, and I think that reality just has those attributes naturally.
There needs to be something which does that, and the only thing which can do that is God.
With the exception that you have yet to establish the need for a God in order to accomplish this. Your entire argument in this video relies on God, specifically the Christian version of God, being the only thing that can give this reality structure and consistency. You just baselessly assert this without establishing why this entity is needed to give structure to reality. You also failed to distinguish God from just the nature of reality. You rely on a God of the gaps argument to establish that God is needed. Then, you provided a false dichotomy where you baselessly assert that it can only ever be one God. You then anthropomorphized reality in order to make it seem like we need a being to govern reality. And finally, yes, I have considered all of these arguments. And yes, I still remain unconvinced by these shitty arguments that require fallacious reasoning in order to support their conclusions. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. I hope that you guys will go down below. Let me know what you think about his argument for God's existence. Do you think that he's on the right track? Or do you agree with me and think that this entire argument does not support his conclusion? Hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you want more content like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens!